Thank you very much. I think collectively, thanks to Larry Summers for making the effort to share his thoughts. I know that he would have loved to be here in person, but I think his words are a fantastic segue to the first session. As a matter of fact, in a certain kind of way, we're tackling the difficult issues head on by looking at issues related to industrial policy and the nexus or not to national security. What I would like to do is, since we're among colleagues here, I will just mention the names of the first fantastic panel that we have. And you all have your name tag on the back of it, and I think also your program, there's a QR code that has the complete set of bios. So please use that if you'd like to have more information. So let me start out with, again, a fantastic panel that we have. Next to me is Denny Quah, who is the Dean and Professor of the Lee Kuan Yew School, of course, very well known here in Singapore and beyond. Then we have Huang Yiping, who is Dean and Professor at the National School of Development at Peking University. Tony Saich, Director at the Rajawali Foundation Institute at the Harvard Kennedy School. Yeling, a Professor at the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University. Rana to my right here, who's also Professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, and Shiro Armstrong, a Professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University and Director of the Australia-Japan Research Center. With that, what I would like to do is we will have short presentations or interventions by each speaker first, and we'll then reserve the time at the very end for a comprehensive Q&A. So with that, Denny, maybe I can pass the baton to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Alfred, and thank you again, once again, to the organizers for putting together such a wonderful conference. I was asked to speak about economic performance and national security, and I thought, okay, this is going to be a really short paper, because the way economists think about national security is extremely straightforward. It is a guns versus butter textbook description. You can either have more guns or you can have more butter, but you can't have both. And so industrial policy or economic policy more generally and geopolitics, they do not meet except as antagonists. So I've been at many economics conferences, I think many of us have, where there's some elaborate economic analysis that's been put out, and then at the end, if something goes wrong with that model in comparison with the real world, well, that's just because of geopolitics. Geopolitics has become, for many economists, simply another way to say bad economics. I don't think that's a very productive approach to this question. So what I'm going to do in the 8 minutes that I've got now is to try and suggest to you there's a way to triangulate these two very different opposing views. There's a way to think about these things in a coherent way. And then using that coherent approach, economists can have sensible conversations with people who are worried about national security. People who are worried about national security need no longer think that economists are simply naive. That there's a way in which we can talk in a sensible way about the trade-offs that are involved in industrial policy and geopolitical competition. What I'm going to land on is this idea that we need to get rid of this guns versus butter approach. Strengthening national security does not have to degrade economic prosperity. That, however, does not mean national security can go about and just do anything it wants. It can't be arbitrary, it shouldn't be random, and it shouldn't be just for those who are interested in policy making that actually advances the well-being and security of any given nation. The reins should not be handed over to just economists or to just national security policy. It should be a combination of both. And what the work that I've done here is an attempt to try and identify where those trade-offs are, how you can actually mediate in a sensible way that conversation, how you can put numbers on the way in which different members of this policy community wish to engage with each other. And as a payoff, at the very end of it, a lot of what I've been working on recently is the idea that the international system cannot be left to just the great powers to determine. It has to be a conversation and an engagement where small states, middle powers, or third nations more generally can help great powers evade the gridlock that almost inevitably they're headed into right now, not least given the set of considerations that Larry Summers has outlined for us so well. So there are three things that, for those of you who are interested subsequently in the paper or in the presentation in more detail, there are three things that I do here. I'm going to cut to the chase in the limited time that I've got, not go through the detail, but there are three things that I do here is set a context for how we discuss geopolitics and economics coherently together, bring out how industrial policy and national security can be modeled. The interesting things about that model is that it provides us a way to think about how you distort decisions to improve the situation for everyone. And that gives us a way to think about cross-national strategic responses and the role of third nations, small states, middle powers, in helping great powers evade the gridlock that they are almost certainly headed into. I won't have time to do this, but there's an empirical section to what I do that looks at the statistics and looks into case studies of CFIUS, Nippon Steel, and America's responses to Japan in the 1990s and to China's industrial policy today. But that's for those who wish to have the detail. First, economics might have gone into this thinking that it's simply guns versus butter, but then it got a rude scolding. Gina Raimondo, in an address that to business leaders, said basically, wake up and smell the coffee. You guys need to stop thinking that you can go about doing your economics, commercial things, and think that national security is someone else's problem. What we're doing here is helping you become more prosperous. It's not guns versus butter, it's us working together. But before then, of course, over the decades in the run-up to that, Blackwell and Harris and other people lamented how, unlike an earlier era, economic statecraft, the exercise of economic instruments, previously had been used to advance every nation's foreign policy interests. Colonialism was part of that grand sweep of engagement. But over the last 50, 70 years, there has been a disengagement between the two, partly due to Milton Friedman, who felt that political freedom came from economic freedom and that the two needed to be talked about with economic freedom first, but there has been a separation of these two. That separation needs to be wound back. And it needs to be wound back, not least because the urgency of the security situation that we're in, with the great powers looking at each other down the barrel of, well, this kind of engagement that America is looking at a hostile hegemonic power gaining ascendancy in the Asia-Pacific region, that China feels that the West is in a campaign of containment and encirclement. China's development of its fractional orbital bombardment system is something that has alarmed many observers in the West, and many of the deployments of the Seventh Fleet and others around this region have set off alarm bells for both sides. Economics no longer stands apart from all that. Economics is now quite compliant, not just because Gina Raimondo scolded us, but because economics has started to work with what Jake Sullivan calls a new economic philosophy, that whatever the reality of the China shock, on the ground for policymakers, the China shock is real. And China is viewed as stealing American jobs, hauling out American industry, turning into ghost towns what were once thriving middle-class American communities. That has to stop. Whatever the reality of comparative advantage, the point is, this is the perception now, this is the political reality. So how do we advance given a landscape of economic philosophy that Jake Sullivan and others both in the Biden and presumably in the upcoming Trump administrations have laid out. The China shock is real. So what I'm going to do next is something that there's some people in this audience who are technical economists who prefer to look at Greek when I say English, but there are those who don't. So for those who don't, look away from the screen. But for those who do, the idea that I am working with is that policymakers have two kinds of national strategies. One is a strategy that weakens their national industry, but that keeps national security strong. Another is a set of policies that strengthens national security, but at the same time also strengthens the economy. Dual-use technologies would be one example of that. Subsidies would be another instance of these kind of strategies that help both. But there are two different kinds of strategies. Modeling that the world uses these two different kinds of strategies leads to an outcome where, however strong the concern for national security is, it remains quiescent. It does not disrupt industrial policy. Economic policymakers have their say. But there's a threshold. Once the concern for national security gets large enough, all hell breaks loose in the model and presumably in reality. People become much more concerned and are willing to sacrifice economic performance. I suggest that that's the way the world is now. But one of the outcomes of this is that, in behavioral economic policy making, there's the notion of nudging. You can have, for small policy efforts, engender a large policy change. In this model, in this technical model, nudging is a good policy. You can nudge national security. Okay, my time is up. You can nudge national security to try and bring the world to a situation where policymakers are still concerned about, sorry, this is not working out. You can nudge policymakers.
It is persistent.
Yes. It's a concern for national security. Okay. So you can nudge policymakers into a situation where there can be mutual concern over national security, but the strategies that you take will still keep your economies robust and strong. In other words, you don't have to get into a prisoner's dilemma kind of game where America and China, the great powers, stare at each other and attempt to outdo each other in armament and military spending. You can still be concerned appropriately for your individual country's national security, but you can still inadvertently cooperate on strengthening our mutual economies in exactly the way that Larry Summers described. So the work that I've been doing is an attempt to try and quantify this thinking, that the concern for national security is real. Economic policy making needs to acknowledge that, but it is not a guns versus butter situation, except when things become too extreme. We need to work at cooling the temperature of the conversations between the great powers, maintain their concerns over their own national security, but still be able to work in a collaborative way. Because as Larry points out, we're in the same boat. We need to get the boat to shore, even though we don't really care about each other. So that's the work that this is about. And for those who are interested, there's an unpacking of how this thinking helps us understand the behavior of CFIUS in the United States, industrial policy in each of the two great powers, and it gives a role for third nations, small states, diplomatically aware nations like Singapore, to be involved in conversations to lower the temperature, lower the national security concern to where it's below that critical threshold. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You have set a very high bar because I think you've done two things. First of all, you started out to think about a framework to find an optimal solution given the constraints. And you're actually combining the framework with supportive data. So I'm sure that we'll have a little bit of a discussion on this going forward. Let me invite Yiping to go next.
I like to offer some non-expert observation of the topic. Danny just analyzed using a theoretical framework. That's in relation to the new green energy products, especially the EVs. And I have to acknowledge, I'm also not an expert on the EV sector. We'll hear some stories later today or tomorrow. But how to connect these two? The first thing I noticed is that there's been an expansion of definition of national security from my reading of the literature, policy literature in the US. And the latest article by Daniel Dresner in Foreign Affairs basically explains how everything became national security and the national security became everything. That's my starting point, and I think one side of the story, national security concern, expanded quite drastically over the past several decades. We hosted Janet Yellen early last year when she came to our school, and we had a long discussion about the China-US economic policy. She was very concerned about the overcapacity problem in China. She didn't really mention national security, but she was quite worried about the state subsidy, state direction in development of the new green energy products. And the concern is about jobs, industry, and so on in the US. She visited us in April, and in May, the US raised the tariffs on the EVs imported from China to 100%. So again, as I said, she didn't specifically use the term national security, but the policy action was quite significant. But I did hear discussions in the US, and people worry that if EVs are running in the streets of the US, that's a big national security threat to the US. Their arguments made something like that. If you look at the industrial policy in China, I checked through the policy document, and China did start quite early encouraging research, development, and the production of EVs. The earliest document I found was in 1991. And then over the past following decades, the government was continuously putting out the policy measures trying to promote that industry. And that, I think that's how some people feel that the government was involved quite heavily in that sector. But one question I think, as Yellen and some other US officials mentioned about the subsidy, I actually found some studies comparing the explicit subsidy on EVs across countries. And this is done by Professor Li Sanjun and his colleagues from Cornell, who is going to join Stanford, I understand, very soon. According to their numbers, and you find that the explicit subsidy by the national government on EVs per unit of EV is not particularly high. It's somewhere in between. In fact, Norway and the US are much, much higher. But obviously that there's a category of the number of policies included. But just want to show you from these numbers, it doesn't, China doesn't stand out as a heavy subsidizer of the EV producer. But obviously, Scott and his colleagues did a fantastic project on red ink. And the finding was quoted or cited by Jay Shambo a couple of months ago when he talked about the Chinese overcapacity problem. I think, if I understand correctly, and correct me, Scott, if my interpretation is wrong, basically they tried to measure the implicit subsidy, looking at the cost distortion. According to their number, which was something like 5% of GDP, i.e. through the lower cost of credit, of the land or whatever you can find, about 5% of GDP, which is 10 times as much as US, Brazil, Germany, and Japan. And that's how I think Jay Shambo's takeaway was, well, maybe your explicit subsidy is limited, but your implicit subsidy is quite massive. Incidentally, that's actually an area I worked on 15 years ago, looking at the cost distortion. And my own finding was very similar. I mean, these numbers I put on here were 15 years ago for China, and the number were remarkably similar to the CSIS study, about 5% of GDP. However, my interpretation is quite different from what Jay Shambo is trying to take away. The reason why there is cost distortion in China is because of the dual-track liberalization, i.e. we still want to maintain the state sector, but we want to liberalize the private sector. When the private sector is liberalized, they're much more competitive, and the state sector was losing ground. But the government thought that these sectors are still important, politically, employment-wise, or whatever reason. So they need to implicitly subsidize these state-owned companies for them to continue to operate. And you can obviously provide fiscal subsidy if you have money, but they don't have. So the factor cost distortion was a way of facilitating dual-track liberalization. If that interpretation is right, then I think we shouldn't simply making the assumption that these were for the new industries. In fact, I would argue most companies nowadays competing in the international market, especially in the new green energy sector, they're all privately owned. If they're privately owned, domestically speaking, they are disadvantaged by this cost distortion, not benefiting from the cost distortion. So I think I'm not denying there are some implicit subsidies there, but just simply to say that you have 5% of implicit subsidy, and that's why you have such a strong green energy sector, that's probably not very accurate. Having said that, I have to accept that there are some implicit subsidies by local government and the so-called investment promotion programs. And this is why I think, while I do not necessarily agree that state subsidy was a main factor contributing to the success of the new green energy sector, but state direction probably played some role, because when the central government said we needed to develop this industry, all local governments tried very hard. To start with, at the beginning of the reform, one of the economic reform policy was decentralization, meaning the decision power was handed down from the center to local government, which immediately triggered a very strong economic growth, because the local authorities' autonomy and incentive was substantially expanded, and that was one of the reasons why it was very successful. So I think we do see kind of impact of these local governments' investment promotion programs, and the fact that we have lots of EV and solar panel factories around the country, although almost all of them are privately owned, but local government did play a very important role in facilitating that development. And that's something I think we'll probably need to improve on. So my takeaway from this simple story is that I think we need to be careful when we talk about national security. If EV is a national security concern, then there are probably ways to deal with that national security concern instead of simply just stop importing from overseas. And ironically, a couple of weeks ago, a group of us, we were in the US and exchanging views with government officials and think tanks at the Peterson. I was a bit surprised that one of the senior fellows, he used to work with, respected senior fellow, and I respect him quite a lot because he used to work for the Fed for a very long time. And we were talking about the EVs and so on. And he said he thought that the EV sector should be protected. And I said, why? Well, he said he didn't know, but he felt that this is a security issue. But what kind of a security issue? I don't know. Either because the auto industry is so huge in the US, so allowing like cheap imports would not be meaningful for them. In the end, he said, well, maybe auto industry is important because if in emergency situation, you can turn the auto industry into a weapon-making industry or something like that. But my argument is that these concerns should be addressed, but there might be better ways addressing these concerns. Like if data is an issue, then you can set some rules making sure that the US data are actually only stored in the US and not accessed from other places. Technology-wise, I think that's possible. But on the Chinese side, I think the one big question not everybody acknowledge or appreciate today is that we grow from a small country economy to a large country economy. And I think that makes a big difference. When you're a small country economy, whatever industrial policy you're undertaking, if people are not happy, they criticize you, but honestly, they don't care because you're so small. But when you become a very big player, it makes a big difference. And that's why I think the size is also very important today. Even if you argue all of the production capacity is built on the basis of market forces, it still causes a problem because adjustment cost for the rest of the world is much bigger now. So I do think industrial policy in China needs to be improved. On the one hand, the local government investment promotion program need to be certainly rationalized. The local government activity was important, but I would argue that handing down the decision power from the center to the local government is not the end of market-oriented liberalization because the decision power is still with the government, low-level government, and it needs to be handed down to the market and to the enterprises in the future. The short-term good news is that now the local government subsidy is dropping significantly because they all run out of money. But whether that's sustainable or not, I'm sure Christine will discuss about this later. But at the latest, the third plenum of the 20th Party Congress, the decision explicitly said they want to reform the local government's investment promotion program. They want to regulate the local government behavior, explicitly prohibit irregular and illegal subsidies by the local government. So I think we pointed to the right direction. How impactful that is, I don't know. Related to this is also obviously very important that we needed to balance our external account. When we say overcapacity, big country economy have an impact on the rest of the world, one of the biggest problems is our savings are just much greater than investment. So inevitably, you have a huge current account surplus. When that exists, whatever you do, you will have to export to balance your domestic economy. For a small country economy, that's probably feasible. But for a large country economy, that becomes very difficult. So I think balancing the domestic economy is probably a very important first step. Finally, we already have this huge capacity in green energy sector. How we deal with it, I think this is the issue not related to today's discussion, but I had a proposal earlier on about the possible Chinese Green Marshall Plan, utilizing the Chinese capacity to facilitate green energy transition in developing countries. I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
I think the point that you made again, that there is emotions involved when you talk about industrial policies and subsidies, even among people that principally are rational. I think that is a phenomenon that is quite widespread. The good news is your point on local governments. I think we will have a lot of time to discuss that further, but I think that's a very important point. If we could pass on the baton to Tony.
Yes, thank you. I think perhaps one of the most important but most unpredictable factors which is going to impact on the topic that we're going to talk about over these couple of days is, of course, the advent of the second Trump administration, and especially his policy towards China. I think in terms of what the president was talking about last night, the incoming administration has both structural factors which are going to drive its policy, which have been pretty well rehearsed and were talked about last night, and I think Larry touched on. But then there's also the idiosyncratic aspects of it, which are indivisible from Trump as a person, which is clearly going to be influential in this. I think one of the key questions, and this is not just with the China policy, but across the board, is the key question is which Trump is actually going to turn up. Is it the deal-making Trump who really wants to use threats to get a better positioning, or is it the aggressive competitor who is determined to be number one and crushed any perceived competitor? Certainly, if you begin to look at the appointments that he's been proposing to date, one would think it's the latter, perhaps rather than the former, with the slew of people that he's been brought in. I don't really think it's worth talking about China hawks anymore, because basically everyone in Washington is a hawk, so it's very difficult to actually distinguish China hawks in the general atmosphere in Washington. But of course, then people do talk about the counterweight to that, with people such as Elon Musk and various others in the financial sector who might counteract some of those tendencies. I thought what was interesting was looking at a very influential report by Tellis and Blackwell that actually came out just for the first administration of Trump, and looking at the most recent Heritage report to see what has remained consistent and what is actually shifting in terms of policy directions. So I think the approach, of course, from the Trump supporters, including those right-wing think tanks, has been fairly consistent since the first administration, and if anything, attitudes have hardened in preparation for that. Both those reports, the Heritage and the Tellis and Blackwell, confirmed that the important policy shift is now to balancing the rise of China's power rather than continuing what they say is the assistance in its ascendancy. Both have the conclusion that the US efforts to integrate China into the liberal international order have generated new threats to US primacy in Asia, hence the concerns more around economic security, and that's become the most common refrain across Washington. There's a number of similarities, revitalizing the US economy, strengthening the military, creating a tougher technology control regime, etc., etc. But there are a couple of four interesting differences, I think, in the reports. For example, Heritage calls for the limited use of tariffs and non-tariff barriers, something which wasn't there when the first administration was preparing, and that reflects, of course, the strength of Trump's views around tariffs. Secondly, the Heritage report is much more explicit now about the need for reshoring, restricting outbound investment to China, and expanding export controls. And thirdly, I thought this was fascinating. Heritage actually rejects the transition to an economy driven by green technologies, something which Trump has raised, because it sees those technologies as being dominated by China, going back to the things that Yiping was actually counteracting, I thought, quite effectively in his comments. And therefore, not surprisingly, Heritage stresses reversing the explosion in business regulations. It sees ESG guidelines as a particular barrier to development. And fourthly, in contrast to the first report, it has much stronger views about the need to support Taiwan. In the paper that I wrote, I have looked at three different aspects. The question of tariffs, the question of Taiwan, and the questions of small yards and high fences. I think on the question of tariffs, it's been pretty well covered. I won't go into that in any detail. We all know what has been proposed. I think one thing that is going to happen pretty quickly is that there's the bipartisan congressional committee, which is called for entering the permanent normal trading status. I would expect that to happen pretty early on in the administration, perhaps before tariffs are able to get up and running. But again, I think the question really comes up here is whether Trump intends to use these measures as a weapon or a threat, as a negotiating tactic to get a favorable phase 2 trade deal. And of course, that's what he did in the first administration. He used a lot of the threats to get what he thought would be a favorable phase 1 trade deal, which he wasn't satisfied with, and COVID blew it apart anyway. Or are they really intended to harm further China's growth prospects, as a number of his proposed appointees would support? And in fact, although China's been pretty good at diversifying, it's still heavily export dependent. And there's very severe limits to what China can actually do to avoid some of those threats. And we're already seeing other countries now countering with tariffs and barriers towards Chinese exports, where they feel their own native industries are also getting hit. Devaluing the currency is also going to set another whole range of problems related to exports, cost of exports, and the implications for other countries and so forth. So we're already seeing there was, since the start of 2022, I counted up that there were 250 trade defensive measures to counteract Chinese imports. And interestingly, the overwhelming number of those did not come from the United States of America. And in fact, over 120 were initiated by Brazil. So there's generally concerns, not just in the US, but across the economies. On Taiwan, it's mostly support as being crucial. A number have spoken out on that. And in fact, we shouldn't forget that actually in Trump's first administration, he was actually oversaw a very significant increase in arms sales to Taiwan. There was a lot more diplomatic activity with Taiwan than had previously been the case. And of course, what Trump is proposing to stop a Chinese invasion is his favored tariffs, in this case a 200% tariff on China should they undertake aggressive activities. Of course, he also claimed that Xi would not invade Taiwan, as he respected Trump, and he knows that I'm fucking crazy. That's his own words, not mine. Yet, of course, he's also expressed ambivalence about Taiwan and its value to the United States. Elon Musk has talked about it in the same manner as Hawaii, for example. And of course, first of all, Trump has called on Taiwan to contribute 10% of its GDP towards defense. Not going to happen, obviously. He's also accused Taiwan of stealing the American semiconductor business, and he's also said that he might put an extra tariff on chip exports from Taiwan, which could be devastating for a number of companies and economies around the world. As people know, Taiwan accounts for something like 68% of all global chip production and 90% of the most advanced chips. I think the one area which I think we really need to pay more attention to is around the idea of the small yard and high fences. I don't think it would have mattered who actually won the election. The yard is going to get bigger, and the fence is going to get much higher. And both America and China even more so perhaps, are investing in the technologies of the future. And there's a clear recognition in Beijing and Washington that whoever controls those technologies is going to have huge geopolitical influence in addition to the economic benefits. I think China's looked at America in the past, perhaps Britain before. It really shows that those countries which dominate the technologies of the future begin to create standards, norms, practices which become increasingly beneficial to their own domestic economy and their own power projections. So we saw most clearly with the Biden administration its attempts to thwart China's capabilities in certain fundamental industries that were developing those technologies for the future. That was intended to hamper progress in e-commerce, autonomous vehicles, cybersecurity, medical imaging, amongst others. And I think the intent, in my view, was not to target specific products, but actually was rather to undermine entire industries. And Washington actually has a lot of potential and a lot of strength and other arrows to its proverbial bow that if it wants to pursue further down that road, it really can put blocks on a number of key technologies which are crucial for China's development in biotech and a number of other areas, for example. So the measures, while decoupling obviously is not going to happen, these kinds of measures do push decoupling in the technological sphere. And I think this is going to be where a lot of the tension is going to come, both in the region and beyond, because most of the nations, of course, do not want to be forced to choose between the US and China. But I think in the realm of technology, that's going to be less feasible. It seems to me it's not going to be possible, or at least it's going to be very cumbersome or extremely expensive to operate one system based on Western technologies and another based on those of China. So let me just finish there.
Thank you very much. I think you have done a fantastic job at it's what is called reading the tea leaves, basically, and then trying to subtract some information from that. Can we move on to Yeling Tan?
Thank you very much, and my thanks to the organizers for the chance to speak today. It's an honor to be on this panel. So as we look across the world, it doesn't really matter which direction you look, but we see governments looking to economic security as a global policy priority. What's interesting to me is that while this term is commonly used, the meaning that different governments adopt the term with varies quite a lot, and that is not very well understood. This ambiguity actually drives security dilemmas in that they generate a greater probability of misunderstanding, right? And so we see this most clearly in the US-China action-reaction cycle. My actions to raise and strengthen my security generates insecurity in the other party, triggering a counter-securitization on the other side, and we're off to the races. And the danger here for all concerned is that it heightens the risk of a conflict that is really unintended from the beginning. So how do we tackle this economic security dilemma? So in some ongoing research that I'll share with you today, I want to examine just one side of the dilemma, which is to look at policies emanating from the China side and to try to unpack what economic security means from the China perspective. And what I want to do is to examine the range of various policy strategies that fall under this very broad, and as Yiping pointed out earlier, it's an expanding umbrella that constitutes economic security. and to then consider which of these strategies do trigger a policy escalation, right, which drives us deeper into the dilemma, which of these policies might actually lead to de-escalation. Classic international security literature would suggest that one way to escape a traditional security dilemma is better signaling over whether your intention is offensive versus defensive. And I think when we look at the economic security dilemma, the solutions might not be as straightforward. And this becomes clear once we look at some of the Chinese policies. So what I did was to collect a bunch of policy documents coming from China's central party state, the Central Committee, so from the party central committee, the executive body, and the legislature, policies that contain the term economic security. You'll see from this graph that the corpus of documents begins from 1998, which is when the term started to be used officially in policy discourse with the emergence of the Asian financial crisis. And what I did was to basically read through these documents, and it was a really fascinating exercise because what emerged from this exploration of the term economic security as used in official policy discourse is a typology, right? Economic security that varies according to two dimensions. Firstly, in purpose, whether it is market enhancing, market building, or market curbing in its purpose. And secondly, in posture, whether the posture is defensive or offensive. So let me just explain what I mean by purpose and posture here. So in terms of purpose, right, market building, what is the logic here? The logic is quite simple. You see from reading the documents that there's an approach to economic security that is really about building strong markets. By building strong markets, you strengthen your economy and you strengthen your nation. However, there are security spillovers from this liberalization project that will threaten this growth imperative. Therefore, state intervention is needed to address these security threats so as to enhance market functions, right? So as to keep that market building project going. So that's the overall purpose. The market curbing purpose is quite different, and I think will be very familiar in today's political context, right? In this logic, the liberalization project threatens the party's control over critical economic lifelines. Why is this a problem? It's a problem because it generates vulnerability, because foreign firms, private firms cannot be trusted to operate in the nation's best interest. Therefore, state intervention is needed to curb the reach of markets. And you see these two logics existing side by side, and different logics becoming stronger at different points in time and also across different parts of the bureaucracy. In terms of posture, again, this is fairly straightforward, but let me just quickly run through the logics here. What does a defensive posture look like in the economic realm? Right, the policies talk about the need to intercept, to diffuse, to block perceived economic security threats, either as they are arising or sometimes in anticipation of these threats occurring. On the offensive side, right, the offensive posture basically attempts to actively overcome perceived security threats, right, either by repressive measures, by prosecutorial measures, or by other types of expansive methods. So when you put these two, the postures and the purpose together, what you end up with are four different types of strategies, right? An inspector strategy that is defensive market building in nature, a prosecutor strategy that is offensive market building in nature, a planner strategy that is defensive market curbing, and a warrior strategy that is offensive market curbing. So what do these policies look like? Let me just give you a glimpse of what they look like. The defensive market building strategy relies in part on deep surveillance, right, to screen out some of the harmful elements that might enter your economy, right? So this will also involve enforcing health and safety standards, strengthening accounting standards. It also emphasizes the need for international cooperation to share information, to set common benchmarks so that China's economy can operate smoothly with the rest of the world. So you see this coming from China's standards agencies, right, talking about the need to safeguard economic security in order to strengthen rather than weaken or to undermine trade liberalization. You see this coming from the audit agencies. So domestically within China, the audit agencies talk about their screening and surveillance function as acting as an immune system, right, to ensure the healthy development of China's national economy and society. Right, the State Council talks about the need for law enforcement cooperation across borders in order, again, to strengthen risk prevention and early warning systems. On the offensive side, right, and this is very much complementary to the inspector role, you see policies talking about the need to combat crime, for example, right? The threats that might undermine market functions as China is undergoing and building markets in its reform process. There's crime on the rise, economic crime, organized crime, and so on. And so the task of maintaining social and political stability remains very strong. This is from the prosecutor's office, right? And you see the Trade Ministry also talking about the need to combat unauthorized fundraising, unauthorized financial institutions, and unauthorized financial operations. All of these, again, in the pursuit of stronger markets rather than weaker markets. On the flip side, right, there is a market curbing logic as well that coexists, right? And so many of these policies talk about the need for state intervention, particularly in terms of the need to control the flow of capital, right, in and out. So part of this will be is about maintaining the fixed exchange rate. Part of this is a guiding catalog to steer the flow of foreign capital into various types of industries and to ensure state ownership in what are called economic lifelines in China. So one classic expression of this concern would be the National People's Congress statement as China entered the World Trade Organization, discussing the need to gradually open up the market and to ensure that the country controls the lifelines of the national economy so as to safeguard economic security. On the warrior side, right, so this is the offensive market curbing set of policies, right? You see this also in the policies, a discussion of the need to expand China's capability outwards. So not just about screening or curbing the inward flow of capital, but for example, here in the maritime industry, the need to strengthen China's standing in international maritime shipping. What's interesting and a clear turning point is also the emergence of what's called the comprehensive national security concept in China, which emerged around 2014 and was encapsulated in the National Security Law in 2015, that starts to connect these different types of security concepts and to place them in a more coherent framework, right, with political security, economic security as the foundation, and so on. So now different types of security are linked to each other. And in my analysis, I started to try to track the relative prevalence of different types of economic security strategies over time. And what you can see is that from 2014 onwards, there is a clear rise in the warrior type of phrasing in Chinese policies that increasingly link different types of security together, right? And so this can be seen in this figure here, right, which is just a coding of the different types of security that emerge, different types of security terms that emerge in my corpus of documents, right? So not just economic security, but you see from 2014 onwards, and especially in recent years, a proliferation of different types of security: network security, information security, data security, technology, and so on and so forth. And they're all linked together under this comprehensive national security concept. So it's, in a sense, it's becoming less clear, right? What is economic security? Because one type of security bleeds into another type of security. And this will affect industrial policies as well, of course. As others have talked about, the crux of this really comes down and emerges in the technology realm. So in the technology issue, you also see an evolution of the types of security framing, and especially from the late 2010s onwards, you see the elevation of technology into the comprehensive security concept, and the emphasis of control, right? So rather than strengthening market functions, which also you can see other types of policies in the technology realm in earlier years talking about the need to build markets. From the late 2010s onwards, you see much more emphasis on the need for control, right? For technology to be independent and controllable, and for the parties' comprehensive leadership to be strengthened as well. This is a figure from a forthcoming paper. So this is a slightly different analysis. It looks at around roughly 500,000 media articles that are concerned with technology over a 20-odd year period. And what you see here is the tracking of two different types of discourse, right? The solid line tracks the prevalence of discourse related to decoupling in media articles related to technology. The red dashed line tracks the discourse related to international cooperation in technology media articles. And you see that for much of China's history, technology discourse is really about international cooperation. This changes quite starkly from 2018 onwards. And from around 2021, for the first time, you start to see discourse on decoupling exceed discourse on international cooperation. So this, to me, really starkly highlights the security dilemma that the US and China are entering into. So to conclude, what are the implications here for where we are today? So I hope to have shown you from this small exercise that economic security, at least as it exists within Chinese policy discourse, is multidimensional, right? And not all policies have escalatory consequences. Some do and some do not, right? So this means that unlike traditional international security theory, the reactions do not fall along your traditional offensive-defensive divide, right? There's an offensive prosecutor function that actually emphasizes cross-border stability, that emphasizes cooperation, right? And this type of offensive economic security that would not, by nature, trigger an escalatory reaction from the other side. Rather, it triggers the need for cooperation. At the same time, there are defensive market curbing policies that do trigger an escalatory foreign policy reaction because they're seen as discriminatory against foreign capital. And when market access, when market size is de facto limited, this turns into a zero-sum game. So there are new implications that policymakers need to think through in order to try to think about, in the economic realm, how do we de-escalate? How do we send credible assurances that is different from the earlier periods that we have gone through, such as in the Cold War and so on. So I think a lot more research and a lot more policy discussion needs to be focused around what does de-escalation mean in the economic security realm. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very helpful framework to organize our discussions maybe later on as well. Maybe we can move on to Rana?
Sure. Thanks. Thank you. Okay, thanks very much indeed, Alfred. And again, great pleasure to be here in this very distinguished company. So what I would like to do is to speak for about 10 minutes or so on some of the ways in which the issues that have been brought up this morning, not least most recently by Yeling and Tony and others, about the dilemmas of defining security at a time when economic growth demands certain types of openness, and to put that in the European context. I'm aware that my distinguished colleague, Niels Redeker, a little bit later, will be speaking in depth about European industrial strategy, and therefore that is not the element that I want to try and emphasize today. Instead, my point is to try and flag up some of the dilemmas. And what I'm going to do is to spend a minute or so just talking about the key areas that I think are currently the ingredients for that dilemma. then spend a few minutes just talking about some of the detail of how I think those are perceived in the broader European context. Broader European context, by the way, is my diplomatic way of saying that as a Brit, I'm aware that Europe is now defined in rather more plural ways than just the EU, central though the EU, of course, is. And then finally put, if I may, a sort of provocation to the conference about where this might lead and issues that need to be resolved. Although, if we manage to resolve them in the course of the next 2 days, I will be very impressed. Here are some of the questions. These are 6, but of course we could have put down 16 or indeed 60 if we wanted to go through an ever-increasing list of some of the dilemmas for Europe, broadly defined in terms of what industrial strategy is and where it might go. The very first question is, what does EU industrial strategy actually mean? Many of you will be aware that, amongst other things, there is a long and well worth reading, actually, European Commission document from last year, which is an expansion of a document that really was given serious consideration during the COVID crisis, which forced a lot of questions to the forefront that hadn't previously been there. So that's one of the key overarching questions that Europe still has to resolve. Second, it is clearly impossible to talk about a European industrial strategy without talking about Germany specifically. And although there are many elements of that German question, the question of EVs, which have been brought up already in the context of China, not least by Professor Huang and others, is clearly a very urgent one for German policymakers. And I know that Alfred, amongst others, is very expert in terms of some of those conversations and their consequences. My third point there, I brought up the UK because, again, the question of Brexit is an illustration of a wider set of issues, again, to do with the point that Tony Saich just made about how far it is possible in the real world to have variation on regulation on technology and other issues at the cost of being able to shape or work with global standards. And the dilemma, again, there is becoming increasingly urgent. So the flexibility that a medium-sized player like the UK might have hoped to have had perhaps a few years ago is now harder to see as a realistic possibility. Fourth, the question of AI. Am I the first person to mention AI in this conversation? It usually comes in the first 3 or 4 seconds of any conversations these days, so I will bring it up. And the question of where European innovation is in a space which is rapidly becoming dominated by the United States and China, of course, is an immensely important question for industrialists in Europe. Fifth, the question of how real the threat of tariffs is. Tony addressed that. I won't go into more detail, but we all know it's very important. And then number 6, again, a point that Professor Huang, amongst others, made. What does overcapacity mean? Is it a term of negative implication used actually to describe greater efficiency on the part of China in certain industrial areas, or is it actually old-fashioned dumping? Or is it a combination of the two? And again, that is a question that is subject to a range of interpretations depending where you sit and where you stand. Let me now move to a few slides that are on some of the questions, again, drawing, I think, a little bit on Yeling's point about how one defines security. And let me put a particular European lens on that issue. First of all, I think it is fair to say that in a broad sense, the new US administration under President Trump, version 2, will probably be less interested in underpinning European security. I think as of the last 24 hours, I will change that slide to say less interested in underpinning European security in the sense that has been conventional since 1945. On the other hand, clearly the issue of Denmark and its territorial capacity is now very much at the forefront of American geopolitical thinking, at least for this week. The question of whether or not Europe will have to be more autonomous than any time since the 1930s is now a real question in a way that it simply hasn't been during most of the Cold War and post-Cold War period. Second, turn the lens on China. The wide perception in Europe, colleagues here may agree or disagree, but the wide perception in Europe is that China certainly gives tacit support for Russia, which undermines European eastern border security and highlights infrastructural vulnerability. China does very strongly argue that it is following international banking sanctions on Russia. It has not provided weaponry or other active means of undermining Ukraine's defense, and it recognizes Ukraine's sovereignty at the United Nations. The pushback from European leaders is that, nonetheless, in terms of dual-use technology and a variety of more shadow financial activities, China is helping Russia to maintain its position, as well, of course, as buying large amounts of oil. The Yiping incident in the Baltics in the last few weeks, to do with cables, of course, has shown how technology, security, and the international geopolitics of these questions is now becoming something of great concern again to Europeans in a way that wouldn't have been the case a few years ago. And finally, having pushed a lens on the US and China, on Europe itself, I would say, again, I'm biased, but the unstable relationship of the EU with the UK illustrates wider wishful thinking. In other words, the ability, which I think was true perhaps even 5 to 7 years ago, particularly at the time of Brexit, to argue that security conversations sat in one place and economic conversations sat in another place, and the EPC, the European Political Community, could do number one, the EU Commission could do number two, I think is simply proving less and less viable as a separation. A couple of quick notes on that question. I know that Niels will get to this a little later about what European industrial strategy actually is. I won't read out all of this explanation here, but this is taken from the 2024 European Commission document. You can find it online. And again, some of those key words there: green, digital, competitive, strategic autonomy, and of course, pandemic. All of those words, barring the last, I think, have been heard in the last 20 to 30 minutes or so, and they're clearly part of a wider set of European debates. Where in practice are there vulnerabilities in terms of Europe pushing forward that kind of industrial strategy? Well, again, the list could be 6, 7, 20 times as long as this, but some of the key areas include raw materials, electric vehicle batteries, certain types of pharmaceutical ingredients, important for an aging demographic in Europe. Hydrogen, of course, very important in the green fuel environment, semiconductor chips, and cloud and edge technologies. And the graph you see on the right-hand side suggests the percentage of vulnerabilities, so to speak, that accrue to each particular non-European country. And again, China sits very much at the center of that, more than 50% of those vulnerabilities. Again, a little bit more detail. This again is from the 2024 European Commission document, underpinning some of those issues you just saw in graphic form right there. And again, this gives an idea, first of all, that this is not necessarily a matter for existential panic. The overall value of these vulnerable commodities is relatively small, but that nonetheless it does involve dependency on a relatively small number of countries, not all of which are stable economic or geopolitical partners for Europe. So this is not supposed to be counsel of despair, but it is certainly a counsel of urgent consideration. And again, this is one version of the story. I'm aware that there are others, but many of you, all of you, I think, will have seen news stories along these lines in the past few years. This is one particular example from last year, September, European news portal, about the underperformance of European car makers in the EV market. There are counter-arguments. We do know, many of us here, of course, what they are, but nonetheless, the headline story here is one on which Europe, and particularly German manufacturers, but also actually now perhaps less considered regional rather than global manufacturers, and Fiat in Italy comes to mind, where there are significant problems that don't admit of immediate and obvious solutions. I mentioned AI. Let me just give another account here. Again, not a counsel of despair, but at the same time a counsel of urgency, perhaps. So one particular report by Francis Ito put forward the worrying thought that a relative leadership position from the EU as a whole on artificial intelligence in the first decade and a half of this century has now led to a falling back in terms of high-level research in this area compared to what China and the US do. And again, the solution put forward there, and you can see the reference at the bottom, is for more serious investment in fundamental research in AI. And let me bring those all together in the last minute or so that I have, just to say where I think, it seems to me, the dilemmas lie at the moment. Oh, okay. More summons from elsewhere. The first one, again, if we're talking about the European context, and this is not explicit to Europe, and I think it does need to be said, is that growth, economic growth, is central to what is looking like an increasingly disruptive set of political and social upheavals in domestic politics in Europe as a whole. It doesn't matter if it's Western Europe or Eastern Europe. Free, democratic voting publics are voting for parties that are moving towards a more protectionist view of life, and ones that argue that the current, as they would put it, neoliberal economic settlement is no longer working and has not been working for ordinary voters and workers for a very long time. I don't think this is news to anyone here that this is the general vibe in European electoral politics, and not just in Europe, of course. The second dilemma in the red there is that Europe's relationship, and again here I include Europe in the wider sense, needs to both to become closer to China and to separate from China. And that creates the kind of dilemmas that Tony, amongst others, have pointed out. It needs to become closer because, unlike the United States, Europe is not moving against the shift towards post-fossil fuel green energy needs, and China is inevitably central to that stream of energy provision. It also needs access to China's markets, which continue to be very large, and it needs to be in collaboration on technology and IP in areas like EV. Again, a policy decision that the EU is currently making in terms of its rather more subtle use of tariffs than those potentially of the incoming US administration. But that said, it also needs to constrain its relationship with China because of issues to do with security. Again, cybersecurity is primary to European services as well as the UK, and that's an area of vulnerability to Chinese security attacks. And tech links with Russia that China has, particularly in the defense sector, are by definition inimical to European security interests at the moment, which are very much dependent on the containment of Russia. And then finally in that section, growth of course needs US markets as well, but that's going to be harder when potentially tariffs prevent the entry of European goods and perhaps services to the US, and that means that China again becomes an obvious alternative direction to turn, but with the difficulties mentioned there. And the final set of issues, and again, I think this is something that is specific to the European context, and I mention it because, again, up to this point, we haven't talked about Russia very much. In the US-China relationship, although it's there, it's clearly not a central issue in quite that way, because the major issue for the US and China is each other, so to speak. In the context of Europe, that is not true. Russia is, by definition, the major security issue for Europe now and probably for the next decade and beyond. Even in the event of a peace agreement on Ukraine, it's likely to be temporary and it's likely to be unstable. So higher defense spending, not least because the demands of President Trump are going to become an issue for European governments in the next few years and beyond. And that means that higher taxes will be inevitable in Europe. That means that there'll be less spending, more government spending will move to defense. I take Yeling's point that one needn't necessarily separate the way in which tech spend and consumer spending are often seen as separable issues. But that having been said, we have heard from European politicians the idea that the countries of Europe need to work for a war economy, the warrior state, to use your phrasing there in a different context. Now, let's all hope that that is something that is not going to be actually necessary in real life. Let's hope that the war also does not become one between Denmark and the United States. Again, this week that may be a possibility. Next week, let's hope it's something else. But the wider point, and actually, of course, not a frivolous or trivial one, is that Europe is looking at the context of being a continent that once again has seriously to face the possibility of wider instability that comes from the possibility of conflict in a way that has really not been the case for about 30 years since the end of the Cold War. And the fullest implications of what that means in terms of relations with both the US and China are still very much in flux and are dependent on a whole variety of quite volatile political choices, some of which will be made in Europe in the course of the next 2 to 3 years in Germany, France, and beyond. I'll stop there, Albert. Thank you.
Thank you very much, bringing in the European perspective in the conversation. We have Shiro Armstrong.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and let me start by thanking the organisers and what an honour it is to be on this distinguished panel. So I want to pick up a few strands that have been mentioned, but to do so, I'll start first with a debate that's been raging for centuries, of course, to draw a contrast that's relevant for today, and I'll represent it here with two handsome gentlemen. First, Montesquieu, the French philosopher, who's often cited, saying, of course, peace is the natural effect of trade. You know, John Stuart Mill expanded on this, and this is, I think, what we're most familiar with as economists, the commercial peace, the Kantian peace, and what we're used to in Southeast Asia, and of course, indeed in Northeast Asia, but what the European project was based on as well. So trade as a source of prosperity and security. But of course, none other than Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations said it ought to be the case, but it's not. It's become the most fertile source of discord and animosity. And we've seen that a bit today. So this is, a contrast that you take the 1930s, of course, and the post-war period, it's quite obvious. But I think we're moving, especially between the United States and China, but between other countries too, towards this Adam Smith view, where economic interdependence introduces vulnerability, sensitivity, of course, and we just heard from Rana, in fact, the European view of that dependence being a vulnerability. And that's not surprising because interdependence and trade has been weaponized recently with economic coercion and so forth. Now, who's right? Throughout history and present day, you can find many examples of both. I think it all depends on the regime within which countries are engaged. We've enjoyed a period here in the post-war period of having a US-led multilateral system that mitigated the risks. Now the United States in the WTO, for example, has gone from enforcer to spoiler of that system, and countries are having to self-insure against those risks, manage those risks with diversification, hedging, stockpiling, onshoring, and so forth. So we have a suite of economic security policies as a result. Now, some implications of a loss of confidence in this multilateral trading system that's, I stress, not dead, of course, but it's on life support. I guess first is, I don't want to downplay the security risks, but they tend to dominate. We've heard that a few times already. And it's quite obvious national security risks are existential. By the security community, they are assigned an infinite price. That is, no amount of prosperity is worth a catastrophic security outcome. So you tend to retreat to or move towards a corner solution. Of course, you need to deal with these tail risks, but they need not dominate policy making. So there are a number of different ways of thinking about this. Here's a simple diagram. You can think of this as a harsh trade-off, I think, as Danny mentioned earlier, butter and guns. That's not always the case, of course, as Danny mentioned. Now, you might be within this frontier and you have policies that move you towards the frontier, you get more prosperity and more security. You might also be able to expand that policy space. But what you don't want is to end up in the corner solution where North Korea is at, an overemphasis on security. And of course, if you start to corner, I'm going to work on not using this corner analogy so much, but corner countries into this sort of space, you'll end up with, for example, a containment strategy of China ending up with China turning into a Russia, for example, which is something I don't think anyone wants, and Larry Summers is pretty clear on that. But, you know, in this simple mental exercise, you can also expand this policy space, the choice set, or you can narrow that space. I think expanding that space we can think of as international cooperation. I like to think of as, you know, ASEAN, when it's working together, even when it's not, it does preserve that space for its members. And this is where regional plurilateral arrangements can help preserve this and expand this strategic policy space. Now coming to what implications this has for industrial policy, if we think about this issue of, you know, security overwhelming economics, I'll take two examples here, one from Australia and one from Japan, what the response of these countries are. So Australia's announced a Future Made in Australia industrial strategy, industrial policy strategy, that has two streams. This is about 22 billion Australian dollars, so a bit of pocket change for other countries, but this is funding and a policy strategy that is aimed at making Australia a renewable energy superpower. It's got two streams, a net zero transformation stream and an economic resilience and security stream. These two streams sit a little bit awkwardly next to each other, especially when you think of economic security starting to dominate the interests here. The announcements came with a clear and explicit announcement that there's going to be a limit to national security interest mission creep. That's welcome, I think, because that's been missing until late last year or mid last year, that kind of explicit mention. But it also talks about China without mentioning China, and sees concentration in critical minerals markets as a security risk. So there are efforts to diversify away from this high market share with China, and in the process diversify away from comparative advantage and economies of scale. So Australia has done a very good job of creating an interdependent relationship with China, especially on iron ore, where China depends on Australian iron ore. I think the opportunity cost of creating a new interdependence on critical minerals is a question that has yet to be explored fully. My other example is from Japan, and this is where Japan's economic security policies aim to reduce dependence on China, again without mentioning China, but it's pretty explicit and understood. This includes, of course, export controls, tighter screening on foreign investment. It's not just Nippon Steel that can't buy US steel. 7-Eleven is blocking purchase by a Canadian company on national security grounds in Japan. But the most prominent of Japan's economic security policies are industrial subsidies for semiconductors. Of course, we know that Japan was a major player in the 80s, but has, for various reasons, including because of the United States, lost huge amounts of market share in the semiconductor industry. Now, the Japanese government has deployed large subsidies to the tune of 0.71% of GDP in 3 years till last April. And for comparison, the United States in the same period deployed 0.21% of GDP worth of subsidies. So in relative terms, huge subsidies that the Japanese taxpayer can't really afford. And it is mostly going to TSMC and Rapidus. TSMC, of course, from Taiwan, but building factories in Kumamoto, in Kyushu, the southern island, where there is a semiconductor supply chain already, equipment, and so forth. Rapidus, a Japanese company aiming to make cutting-edge chips by next year in Hokkaido, the northern island, without an ecosystem in Hokkaido. So huge amounts of money that look like, at least Rapidus looks like, it's going to have slim chance of success. And Metis, of course, pulled out the old MITI playbook, were quite happy to undertake the old industrial policy with huge subsidies, but in a different world. We're no longer in a catch-up growth environment where winners are known and importing them from overseas, although that's the case with TSMC, but we're in complex supply chains now and at the technological frontier. So some big questions, and this is all done under a number of justified externalities, agglomeration, of course, and downstream industries in Japan relying on semiconductors, but importantly, a security externality as well. So there's a risk of those leading to fragmentation and at best a waste of money, I suppose, but what should we do about it given the weakened WTO and the security interest mission creep that is still there? Well, I think the idea of, and this picks up a few points from Danny as well, but of encouraging unilateral action in the same direction. So what was achieved in APEC with concerted unilateralism, unilateral action in concert through the Bogor goals, free and open trade decided in 1994 by 2020 for advanced economies and developing economies. And that meant that you had an organizing goal where countries could do what's in their own interest and manage the positive spillovers. So here's a proposal for a single green market with the imminent withdrawal of the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement. The green transition imperative driving action in all our countries, but to do so with a framework or some agreement that this is where we want to get to collectively, just like the Paris Agreement is concerted unilateralism, a proposal that requires an open trading system, so open markets for trade and investment in green goods, for example. And that would be a sort of a new set of Bogor goals in ASEAN, ASEAN plus institutions, but of course linked to European efforts in this space. So a way to try to move us away from letting economic security and security risks dominate towards unilateral action that has compounded benefits because we're all doing it together. Great, thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for everybody to really stick to the allocated time, so we have quite a bit of time for discussions. Maybe I could start out with one question, maybe mostly directed to Yeling and Danny. You both proposed basically a framework model. The question I have is to push you a little bit further. Can you use these frameworks, how would you say they could be used to guide, whether it is China, the US, or others, in avoiding unintended consequences? I think you were highlighting that the problem is that the narrative now is on security and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, pushing it into one direction. How can you prevent that from escalating? I think maybe the two frameworks are a way to at least avoid unintended consequences, even if you continue in one or the other direction. I don't know whether Yeling, you wanted to start, and then, yeah.
Go ahead.
Thanks very much. So, it's really the crucial question, I think, in terms of thinking about the security dilemma that we face in the economic realm. And I think, we need to be cognizant of what is pushing both the US and China, in their respective ways towards essentially a warrior strategy and towards an exclusive framing of economic security only through this sort of warrior strategy, right? And I think underlying that is a perception on both sides of each other's strategic intent, right? On the US side, there is a very sort of seductive framing of China as engaging in essentially a predatory, as having a predatory strategic intent towards the US and towards the rest of the world. And that framing is very deeply embedded at the moment within the US and is very, very hard to dislodge. At the same time, in China, there is a perception of the US as engaging in exclusively a containment strategy vis-a-vis China. And that perception is very, very deeply embedded within China, very hard to dislodge. So as long as we have on both sides a relative certainty that this is the strategic intent of the other side, all actions will be, and all information is filtered exclusively through that lens. And so the US does not feel secure until this predatory intent can be defeated. How it intends to do so, I think, is actually very unclear. China does not feel safe until it thinks that this containment strategy can somehow be avoided or overcome and so on. It will not be secure, right? So that's what's driving both countries towards that. And so we think we need to think about ways to in terms of thinking about ways to de-escalate, I actually come back to a need to clarify the strategic intent and the need to dislodge that certainty, right? And the need to dislodge what's happening now, which is the filtering of all information through these exclusive lenses. Until that happens, I don't see the space domestically within each country to move towards alternative framings of economic security that did used to be quite prevalent and that did used to be quite dominant and perhaps can come back again, right? I think one of the things my presentation, I hope, can show is that these concepts are malleable, right? And if they can move in one direction in this period, they can probably move in another direction in another period. So hoping to inject a bit of optimism into this conversation.
Thanks, Alfred, for the question, and Yeling for such a wonderful exposition of this security dilemma issue that we're in. I think there are two important consequences from the framework that I've developed and I'm working through. The first important consequence is extremely obvious. The second, a little bit less so. The obvious consequence is, yes, national security concerns matter, but don't let them overwhelm all other calculations. Even when you are concerned about national security, there is still such a thing as good policy that helps you on national security, and there is bad policy that still helps you on national security. Look for the good ones. And to be concrete, so that it's not just abstract, let me build on an example that Yiping and Rana and others have mentioned. The Chinese EV industry, or the global EV industry. A bad policy there, as you are concerned about your own economic well-being, is to undertake action that seeks to shut down China. Some of this might be tariffs, some of this might be sanctions. You find overwhelming the idea that electric vehicles are part of the automobile industry and therefore direct input into military tanks. China must not have those, at least not good ones. So you shut them down. The alternative policy is that you compete by subsidizing rather than putting on tariffs, by subsidizing your own EV industry. The second is a good policy because the world ends up producing more EVs, which is good for the planet, good for saving the environment. So in that scenario, yes, by all means, be all out concerned about national security, but still think about good ways to do it rather than simply plunging into a bad way to do it. That's the obvious implication. Let me end with the second consequence, which is a little bit less obvious. What this work, the calculations, and the data, and the empirical evidence, and the model itself shows is that there's a tipping point. And that there's a tipping point beyond which national security becomes all-consuming. Don't go to that tipping point. Keep yourself restrained. Now, it is very difficult to do that when you are just two great powers competing with one another, looking at each other, looking into the eyes of each other. You have a tendency to do a prisoner's dilemma dynamic, where each tries to outdo the other. If you can't practice restraint in the sense that President Tarman was talking about, enlist the help of others, enlist the help of third nations to cool down the temperature of the conversation. That has a more than super proportional payoff in terms of cooling down the temperature. So those two, I think, are the consequences from this line of work I'm trying to pursue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The floor is open for, yes, Bajaran?
Yes, I have a question for Tony. And you mentioned that there is this deal-making side, that's the Trump position. Then you have these key appointments who take the so-called strategic view.
Sorry, the microphone, you need to have it relatively close.
Okay, okay.
Or you
So
speak rightly into it. Mhm.
Even if we take the strategic view, that is, I copied the sentence from Tony's slides, damage further China's growth prospects. Is that really in the U.S. national interest? You could have a weaker but hostile China, or prosperous but friendlier China. Which one is better for the U.S. in the long run? The Chinese population actually is quite divided. There are people who harbor very friendly intentions toward the U.S. There are people who are hostile to the U.S. But if it's perceived that the U.S. adopt the position of damaging China's further growth prospect, then you turn those friendly forces into unfriendly forces or even hostile forces. So that's I don't know how much debate there is in the U.S. about this issue, about whether a weaker and hostile China is better for the U.S. in the long run, or a prosperous and friendlier China is better for the U.S. in the longer run. So that's a question. I think that's very important for us to understand. Another question, a question is for Yeling. You offered a topology, and you have two dimensions. For each dimension, you make it dichotomous in the sense that you seem to suggest that market building and market curbing are always in conflict. They don't have to be. In some cases, you need to build a market. In some other cases, the market fails, then you need to curb market failures. Better curbing of market failure actually builds market better. So it doesn't have to be dichotomous. And if you make that distinction as dichotomous, then you make policy discussion a lot more difficult. There is no central ground anymore. It's either this or that. Similarly, offensive and defensive. There is this term that the best defensive strategy sometimes is to be offensive. So that when you fear there is a threat, you want to defend yourself. Sometimes the best way to defend yourself is to go on offensive. So even there, it's not dichotomous. So I very much fear that this kind of topology makes consensus building impossible, makes getting agreement impossible. So that's my comment.
Yeah, let me respond to your first question. I suspect my view is very different from the prevalent view in Washington. I mean, I would rather see a prosperous China as being more beneficial to the United States of America than a weakened and fractured China. I mean, I do think there are important divisions you want to make about how you think about where economic security might lead you to bring in restrictions, for example, on Chinese imports. And I do think this question around electric vehicles, which has come up a number of times, I think is a litmus test, because the automobile industry is so important in America, and the American companies are not doing very well in electric vehicles. So I think the sense there is more sort of support to an industry which has been crucial in the US, but which is not competing particularly well. I mean, the overwhelming atmosphere in the US is not sympathetic towards China. I mean, the most recent Pew report had something like 90% of respondents with very negative views towards China. So it is difficult to shift. And I think what Yeling has identified about the narratives are very important in the way they're seen. I mean, if I was sitting in Beijing, it would be pretty obvious to me that America's strategy is to contain China. I mean, it's has been pretty evident for a long period of time. If I just looked out at the number of military bases, alliances around China, its economic activities, if that doesn't look like containment, I don't know what on earth it actually is. So where do you go from there in that situation? It's hard to put alternative voices out. Just to give one practical example, you know, I did surveys about satisfaction with Chinese government performance up until 2016, when the Chinese government stopped them. And on the whole, they were relatively favorable. And as a result, I'm continually criticized by the Heritage, Pompeo in speeches for, you know, daring to suggest that there was a degree of satisfaction amongst Chinese people with government performance. So where do you go? I think the only route you can take is to argue in terms of national interest, because nothing else is going to cut through that because of the general atmosphere. Then I think you have to identify sort of categories of goods in terms of global public goods, for example, that is absolutely in the US national interest and may coincide with what China sees as its own national interest. And I think there are a number of categories, and it goes back to some of the things I said at the beginning in terms of global commons, global regulation, so on and so forth. And I think that is the only way to kind of pierce through this sort of fog which has descended of mutual miscomprehension and misunderstanding. And it's from both sides. I mean, you know, a lot of what gets intention now is US moves to try and block on security grounds certain Chinese activities like TikTok, so on and so forth. But it actually started in China. If you look back in 2008, Chinese government was very explicit in why it wasn't going to allow Google, Facebook, and those into China. And it said explicitly it was on grounds of national security that it was going to block them. So, you know, both sides have problems with this in the way they use it. And I do think, going back to Yeling's point, and I think that would be a very good thing to come out of this conference, is to try and offer some kind of acceptable definition of what we mean by industrial policy and economic security. But anyway, going back to what I said before, the only way you're going to move it forward is if both sides realize there's something in there that will help promote their own national interest to move something forward.
Thanks very much for the critique. It's very helpful for me as I think through these knotty problems. So to clarify, the framework is not meant to be put forward as a recommendation for negotiations between states, right? The framework is put there to help clarify precisely why it is so difficult to reach consensus, right? It's put out there to clarify the sources of confusion when we talk about economic security, and to help us actually move away from trying to pin down what exactly is offensive versus defensive, because in the economic realm, unlike in traditional security, the lines are very blurry, right? And especially so in technology, because it is dual use. So whereas in Washington, from the US perspective, the National Security Advisor might think, do you not see how constrained, how much restraint we've been imposing on ourselves in adopting a small yard, high fence strategy, right? Do you not see that we could have been so much more aggressive in our export controls? From the Chinese side, they see not restraint, but they see a surgical targeting of precisely those foundational technologies that are crucial to future growth. And so it's the murkiness is what's driving countries, both sides, into this dilemma. And we need to take a step back and think more creatively about ways for de-escalation.
I had Robert, and then there were some, sorry, okay.
Thank you. I want to turn to the very interesting presentation by Professor Huang, the title of which is Subsidy Issue or Size. And I would suggest that even if it is true that the subsidies have been quite equivalent, it's actually irrelevant from the standpoint of what's causing the frictions today. We had frictions with Japan in the automobile industry in the 1980s. How they got competitive was not the issue, really. It was the fact that they were. And they were very large. They were significant. We have, in the United States, have gone through a period in which we have had a huge disruption, which is exaggerated to some degree, but is now thought of as the China shock. And so we're now sitting in a position where it looks as though China shock 2 is just about to come. And it's taking the form of EVs. With the Biden administration, at least you could argue there were positive public goods benefits that resulted from restraining emissions. But we are now dealing with the Trump administration. And so far as they are concerned, to quote Donald Trump, this whole climate change thing is a hoax. And what he is interested in doing, actually, is exploiting America's fossil fuel energy strengths. Now, if you come at that from that standpoint, it used to be that we said the areas of potential collaboration are in dealing with global public goods. That's what Tony just said. Okay, but if you don't think that combating climate change is a global public good worth doing anything about, well, you're not going to be persuaded on that front that what we ought to do is to sacrifice, if you will, our own domestic companies who haven't succeeded in this area and buy from the Chinese. That would be a very sensible strategy if we prioritized climate change. So as I listen to you, I think it is about size, and I think in the next 4 years, we're in for a very tough time, because I really fear that the one area where there appeared to be a lot of scope for potential, although even there the fence had been broadened, when I actually go through a strategic security analysis of solar panels, I think, you know, there's nothing in it from a security standpoint for us to import the solar panels. But nonetheless, I think that your paper, from its title and its focus, I think was very interesting, and I would love to see more elaboration on the size question.
Yashankwan?
Let me build on Robert's point a little bit. I do see a fundamental difference between Democrats and Republicans precisely.
Can you get, a little bit closer,
Yeah,
sorry.
precisely on this climate view. And so if you look at, for example, the debate over the US-China Science and Technology Agreement, the Biden administration in the end supported the agreement after the election. And that during the negotiation with China, climate and public health were agreed items in the collaboration between US and China, science and technology. But that's predicated on the intellectual recognition of the science of the climate when the entire Republican Party does not recognize the science of the climate change. And therefore, there's no need for them to recognize the need to collaborate with China. I think the other difference is that if you look at the Biden administration's policy on Chinese EVs, they did propose to impose tariffs on the EVs, but they didn't impose tariffs on the internal combustion cars, right? So, I mean, for democracy, they just don't have many policy instruments to affect relative prices. Tariff is one way to do it, whereas Trump threatens to impose tariffs across the board. Essentially, there's no industrial policy if you impose tariffs across the board, right? So I think for the US, there's Tesla. So arguably, they have to protect Tesla. So going back to Danny's point, I'm not sure the distinction between protection and subsidy is as sharp as you outlined, right? So import substitution usually requires a combination of both, mostly as an incentive for traditional car makers to move into the EVs, right? So, I mean, I think on economic grounds, you can think of arguments for doing what they have done. But going back to your larger point, the gun vis-a-vis the butter, I think that framework is only true in a static scenario, right? In a dynamic scenario, you can argue, I specialize in butter, and therefore I increase the future capacity to invest in guns. And there's an extra complication with China, which is that I increase my butter, but I increase China's capacity to increase their guns. I mean, that's whether or not that's true or not, but that's the common view, and I would argue a commonsensical view among many policy elites in Washington, D.C., right? So, and there are Pentagon reports that show that the US military has procured military components in the military equipment that the US relies upon for national security. So I think, so there's a very good quote put out by Shiro on Montesquieu vis-a-vis Adam Smith. So let's play the counterfactual scenario to suppose in 1993 and 2001, China had the leadership that China today has. And China was what China is today in terms of politics and market reforms. I don't think US would have gone for the most favored nation trading status and the WTO back at that time. So essentially trade is viewed as a way to change the national security priorities of the other country, right? So this is a famous democratic peace argument. So essentially US was anti-Montesquieu and Adam Smith exposed, right? So I think that's the problem that we're facing. The history has been made, and how do we walk back from that history?
Thank you, Yashin. Thank you for that. Very, very helpful. And obviously, I speak in very stark black and white terms to bring out the point. I am in agreement with you on many of the points you made. On what actually happened in the run-up to China's accession to WTO and the hope for liberalization, Bill Clinton, I thought, sort of made it very clear. He said that China will eventually become like us, because by opening up China, we expose it to the ideas that we find most valuable. That's not a bad geopolitical position to take. Unfortunately, it's not one that anyone holds to now. Clinton thought that it was China holding back on its democratization, according to the theory, Seymour Martin Lipset, Frank Fukuyama, and others, would be like trying to nail Jello to the wall in his very famous speech. Things haven't come out quite the way that he thought they would, but the concerns here, I think, are still, I very much agree with you that the concerns here are the right ones to try and work through. But I oversimplify, and I don't disagree that there are things much more complicated where we need still to unpack.
Maybe Takehiko Nakao first, and then we have...
Thank you very much.
Luca.
So because Japan was mentioned as an example of American pressure to be kind of a challenging country, I'd like to mention my experience of Japan. And Japan was so much bashed by America in 1980s and 90s for semiconductor industries and everything. And everything is regarded a kind of organized, planned kind of conspiracy to expel American kind of the competition. So the semiconductor treaty, agreement and others were agreed, and in the end, Japan had to yield to the pressure of America because Japan was defeated by America in the war, and also it is protected by American security arrangement, including including nuclear umbrella. So Japan had no choice. So there is an element in America that they don't like the challenges of the emerging power economically. So in the case of China, I think the same thing happens, and it is because of a very strong power of industries and the economy, and also militarily they are building up the carriers and they are expanding bases in South China Sea. So there is an element which is similar to that of Japan, and I think there is exaggerations of a kind of a conspiracy on the side of China by the American conceptualizations, including party control and also the other elements of subsidy and green. And those are not so really intention to kind of damage the existing order, but it is regarded by America as if it is to damage existing order and especially hegemon of America. It's exaggerated, but at the same time, assertive attitude in many areas, including military build-up and bases, and also some domestic issues, and also the oversupply, which comes from overinvestment instead of consumption. It's not intentional, and also the ideas of security, comprehensive security kind of ideas, and also anti-espionage laws. Those are regarded really assertive. So I don't know how to make a consensus or management. The Soviet collapsed because of inefficiency. Japan had to yield to the pressure of America. But China is a great, big economy with the industries and also the great investment in technologies and people. So I don't know how it comes to the end, how it can be managed. I don't think there is no absolute solution, but we should manage this to avoid or a kind of the physical conflict. But how can we manage it? And I cannot find a kind of idea about how to manage this conflict compared to the time of America-Soviet conflict and Japan-America conflict.
Thank you very much. Yep, we had Ludger for...
Yeah, thanks, Alfred. I think this is fascinating.
Oh, the same thing is true. I think we have to work on the microphones, and you have to be very close to the microphone. We hear it very.
Okay, is this better? So just two questions. One to Yeling. I mean, I think in your analysis, it's important not to miss turning points. I mean, you have described this trend, but if you look at the data series that you show, I mean, the end shows a clear downturn in this warrior rhetoric, and I don't know how you would interpret this as a blip, or and I mean, you know, or whether this is because I think it's important. If the thesis is that there is this mutual kind of firing up in the rhetoric, you know, I mean, for me, it's always a question: why should China play the game? Maybe they have for a while, but why should they? I mean, they understand this possible reaction functions. They have nothing to win from that, so I wonder whether there is a turning, kind of in a way, whether there is a change. I mean, living in Beijing, my impression is that there is this kind of downturn in the rhetoric. Maybe there are plenty of colleagues here from China who, I don't know, may have a different view. But for me, there is a question, if you make this kind of analysis, to see what, not to miss turning points. The second is on this kind of mapping that Anthony did. I mean, your mapping of, so to speak, the Trump position as regards China includes kind of some of the people that they have been nominated, but I think there's also a lot of business interests and a lot of non-vocal interests. So I don't know whether any Trump supporters are here in the room, but I mean, I find this mapping it looks a little bit incomplete to me. Or how shall we read this? I mean, is it really so clear what you said? Thanks.
Yes. So thanks very much for that. I agree with you. It's important to pay attention, to pay close attention to shifts in discourse, official discourse coming from Beijing. And I do worry that sometimes it's too subtle for others to notice, or that precisely because the narratives, which I spoke about earlier, are so entrenched that they end up getting neglected, right? So if everything is simply perceived as predatory, then shifts are not picked up because it's not consistent with a frame of predation, right? And you can flip it around to say the other side as well, right? If everything is framed in terms of containment, then shifts in U.S. policy might not be taken on board, though it might not land in Chinese policy because it's not consistent with containment. I don't know where we are today because we are we're entering a new American presidency, and there's so much uncertainty on board. So we would, and China is preparing to react to a new era of unpredictability as well, right? So, but I take your point that we should pay attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've come to the end of the session. I want to thank the speakers for their interventions. The good news is that I think many of the topics that we have discussed in the first part will probably percolate a couple of times throughout. So with that, again, thank you very much, and I'll pass on the baton to Yuetzin.